I mean, you need to have a safe environment whereby you are allowed to learn and grow and make mistakes. In a psychologically safe organisation, you tend to see that blame is replaced with curiosity. There's a focus on growth and learning. It's not just about achievement. There's non-judgment. It's about looking at ways to improve and extend. But it's also key to actually business performance. It helps businesses deliver on innovation. It helps them deliver on diversity and inclusion. It helps them deliver on growth.
Welcome to the Debunking Your Growth Mindset podcast with Sean McCambridge. In this podcast, we will unpack practical ways to help you grow and build on your current mindset and challenge old habits so you can see the potential that's within us all and learn how to get out of your own way.
Welcome to the show, guys. We're super fortunate to have Naomi Armitage with us today. Really impressive individual. She's a psychologist by training. She's worked with not only some of the biggest firms out there in the mining and construction sectors, she's also had her own firm, a psychology consulting organisation. So she's really big on growth mindset and how that impacts organisations, but also this notion of psychologically safe environments and cultures. So we're going to unpack that. Thanks so much for listening. Really appreciate you joining us here today as part of the show. Thank you. Naomi, thanks very much for joining us here today. Really appreciate you taking the time to share some of the great information on a couple of key fronts. But by way of background, you're a psychologist by training. You've spent the last almost 20 years working for the likes of BHP and HR. But then, for 11 years, you were a partner in your own firm in Griffin Psychology, consulting to large companies like BHP, Rio, Glencore, John Holland and others. So you've got some fantastic experience, and now you've kicked off your new business, Going Again, and which is really, really exciting. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But I guess I really just sort of wanted to kick off with a question that's really near and dear to my heart, and I think more people should understand, the notion of growth mindset. We talked about that a little bit before we kicked off. But can you talk to us a little bit about fixed and growth mindset? And Carol Dweck, who's a famous sort of author on the subject, the way she describes it is, for some people, failure is the end of the world, but for others, it's an exciting new opportunity. So, from your perspective and your background, what are the basic differences between the two mindsets?
Yes. So, Sean, look, really fixed mindset is that belief that the basic abilities and intelligence are actually fixed traits. You can't change them. So you're born with what you've got. Whereas someone with a growth mindset believe that your talents and abilities can develop through effort and persistence, and that those efforts will be rewarded, by change and mastery of different ideas or topics. So they're very different. When you are someone with a fixed mindset, you tend to avoid challenges or give up easily and try and cover up mistakes because you believe that you need to protect, the view that you may be the expert or everything. And often with that fixed mindset, you don't believe that effort will result in an outcome. You just either have it or you don't have it. So often people with a fixed mindset tend to plateau early in their careers because they don't go on to learn and develop. So it's hard work to maintain that facade, that you know everything and that you can't admit that you have made a mistake. Whereas someone with that growth mindset, they love to have opportunities to learn. They see it as an opportunity to develop. They accept criticism and feedback, and they find lessons in their failures. And they are the ones who sort of tend to, achieve more and have that greater sense of free will and control.
Yeah, I think the next part of that question is a really interesting one for me. And being honest, I definitely think, sort of my teenage years and certainly my early 20s, I think it's fair to say I had a bit of a fixed mindset. And then I had this realization that I wasn't happy with that reality, and I wanted to challenge that. And I think in that moment, I sort of decided to adopt a growth mindset. But literally, it's sort of taken 20 years of evolution for me to constantly work at that, to really shift and go from a completely different mindset to where I am today. And I think the results are a lot different, and life's a lot better because of it. But from your perspective, how does one truly change from a fixed to a growth mindset?
Oh, it's hard, isn't it? It's hard. You have that, that epiphany. I think
Yes.
you and I've talked before. My daughter at her school, they're teaching kids about that. This is the school that she goes to. So, my daughter has this concept that you control your brain, and what you tell your brain is really important, because then it influences what you do. And I mean, this is a 7-year-old who's listening to her, her sibling complain about her maths homework, how hard it is, and that she'll never get it. And this 7-year-old turns around and says, that's a fixed mindset you're having there. You have a growth mindset. Say to yourself, you can do it. Break it down. Just keep
That's
trying.
awesome.
But I think to be able to get to that point and do that, there's sort of two things. And as an adult, it's tricky. The first thing I think is you need to have the right environment. And by that, I mean you need to have a safe environment whereby you are allowed to learn and grow and make mistakes. If you're in an environment where failure is seen as bad, or, you can't afford to lose face because you're punished for that or ridiculed, then of course you're not going to practice a growth mindset, So that environment to make mistakes and accept that's inevitable is sort of that number one thing. And I mean, that's in the workplace. That's about a boss who responds when someone stuffs up and makes a mistake. That initial reaction that the boss has is critical, because it lets them know, look, maybe that's not the best, but look, no worries, we'll work on it and we'll find a solution, versus a boss who will actually ridicule that person or punish that person for the mistake. So environment is the first thing. But the second one is what you said, is actually embracing that it's a possibility, and then just practicing it. Instinctively we want to try and manage our self-image, from when we're really little, when we're in a classroom and, a teacher sort of talks about a complex construct, and she says at the end of the lesson, so does anyone have any questions? Does anyone not understand? That feeling in your tummy, you don't want to put your hand up and say, no, I don't get it, because you don't want to look stupid, because everyone else seems to be nodding their head and agreeing that they know what the teacher's talking about. We have this distinct need to impression manage, that we fit in, that we know what we're doing. We don't want to look silly. So there's that instinctive need to protect that, which really is aligned with that fixed mindset. So breaking that down and actually going, it's okay, I don't have to look good all the time or look right all the time, is really against what we naturally are programmed to do. So you've got to sort of tackle that and feel uncomfortable and let go of your ego and have the courage to do it. And then just implement it in your everyday language and in your everyday behaviours. And again, if I can use that example of my daughter, she's so primed now to language and what it sounds like to have a growth mindset. She said to me one day, Mum, can you draw me a picture of a cat? And I said to her, oh, Isla, sorry, I can't draw cats. And she turned to me and said, no, Mum, you can't yet draw a cat. And I was gobsmacked that this daughter was picking up my language. She said, yet, Mum, is a really special word. It means you can't do something now, but one day you will be able to. So it's about incorporating a growth mindset in your words and actions, every conversation you have, and just practicing it over and over again. And you might surprise yourself.
Well, I think it's a fantastic answer, and it's great to hear that your 7-year-old's really grasping that and tackling that. I think it'd be fantastic if we had more 7-year-olds getting their head around that. But I guess sort of just summarising some of the stuff you sort of talked about, I think, maybe for some, I think the first step maybe is, having that willingness to maybe move forward in a different light, maybe from that fixed sort of growth mindset, and that consciousness that a different way of thinking is possible. And then maybe a bit like your daughter's going through, and or others, that the learning or the tools and the courage to sort of implement some of those things and create some of those habits. But I think one of the things you sort of touched on a couple of times there is just how powerful language is, and the words that we use, how that just describes our reality, and how that sort of moves on to our behaviour, our habits, and all that sort of thing. And I think if I was a bit more conscious of the language, the internal language I was using when I was younger, I think I would have different conversations with myself about situations. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great answer. But I want to sort of move on, and obviously with your new business, Humanology, one of the key aspects that you are educating and coaching on is around psychologically safe organisations. So can you give the listeners a quick summary of what are the key components of a psychologically safe organisation? Because I think we talked about earlier, It's a relatively new term, and the more you sort of read, the more you find out about it. But can you give us a quick sort of summary around what the key components of a psychologically safe organisation are?
Yeah, sure. So Amy Edmondson is really the guru in this field and really sort of put this into practice. And she really defines psychological safety as that belief that you'll not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, problems, or mistakes. So in a psychologically safe organisation, you tend to see that blame is replaced with curiosity. There's a focus on growth and learning. It's not just about achievement. There's non-judgment. It's about looking at ways to improve and extend. Leaders tend to see themselves in a very different light. They see their role as helping others thrive and develop. They don't see themselves as experts or the powerhouse. So as a leader, there's probably 4 questions you could ask yourself to test if you do work within or embody those behaviours of a psychological safe workplace. And the 4 questions I like to ask leaders about are, have you admitted mistakes to your team? Because in a psychological safe workplace, it's likely that leaders do admit their own vulnerabilities and mistakes. The second question is to ask yourself as a leader is, have you asked for help from any of your peers or a supervisor? Because that shows, again, that vulnerability and that view that you're not a knowledge expert, that there are things you don't know. The third question is, have you learned anything new from your team recently? Has someone below you taught something that you hadn't come across before? And the fourth one is around, has a team member confided you or asked you for help? Is that level of trust there amongst the peers for people to feel they're safe to speak up and say, help, I don't know this, or I can't quite get this? Those 4 questions are a really good test of the types of behaviours and questions you'd see in a psychologically safe workplace.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting sort of answer, because I think the historic definition of a leader was maybe the leader had all the answers, and it was probably seen to be weak or, not quite up to the task if seemingly you didn't know. But that sort of goes in the face of what you're sort of talking about there. And I think, maybe we'll talk about that later in terms of the modern leader, but I think it sort of takes an element of vulnerability, but also confidence within that, and also putting the ego to the side to be able to do that. But obviously, as we'll talk about later as well, there's some upside if you can do that. So I guess the next question on the back of that is, why is psychological safety so important to businesses, and why should companies invest in this, in your experience?
Yeah, so there's lots of businesses that are, I guess, seeing this as the way. I mean, some of the common ones are, the Google Aristotle project, which we'll talk a little bit later on, but they really wanted to look at what was the difference between their high-performance teams, and it was psychological safety. Another famous example is the Microsoft. Microsoft have really embodied this concept of a growth mindset organisation, but to do that, they're actually operating within a psychologically safe climate. So again, the performance of their business is significantly different, prior to that step change. What I was seeing when I was looking at setting up the Humanology group, there's so many businesses grappling with all these initiatives. So they've got an initiative around diversity and inclusion, they've got initiatives around innovation, they've got production targets, they've got safety targets, and they're trying to get their leaders and frontline supervisors to actually run all these different programs with different, learnings and education programs behind them. But the fundamental skill that underpins all of the performance in those areas is really psychological safety. So you think about safety. What is a safe, physically safe workplace? It's about where people feel that they can speak up if they identify a hazard. It's about then feeling like that's when they speak up, the hazard's being listened to and there's action taken to address that. That's what psychological safety is. It's that ability to speak up and feel like you're heard and have action taken. Similarly, around diversity and inclusion, the basis to a diversity and inclusion is about people feeling like they belong, that they're part of a team, that they're safe, that even though they might have really different views and ideas, that's embraced. And again, that's the principles of psychological safety. So if businesses tried to simplify down and look at what's the thing that we're going to set as our foundation, if we really just work on building this climate of psychological safety, we'll hit all those pillars of diversity and inclusion. We'll achieve our safety targets, we'll achieve our production, and we'll achieve our innovation. It really has, obviously a business outcome. The performance is better, but also staff are likely to be more engaged and you're likely to retain them. And in the current climate, as you'd know, the market's hotting up. It's more important than ever to attract and retain good staff. So you're also, looking after your resources.
Absolutely. No, I think some good components in that, and we might sort of talk about some of the other sort of tangible benefits tying into that answer later on as well. But I want to just sort of explore the notion of the modern leader and organisation, as we touched on before. I think it's definitely evolved from what it has been in the past. And I think you state that graduates today are looking for environments that excite and ignite them in the future. And I think maybe what was attractive in the past isn't necessarily attractive in the future. So why, in your opinion, is it so important, to the bottom line of companies, in your opinion or experience, around, creating this environment that excites and ignites people?
I think, Sean, you touched on it before. Once upon a time in business, the leader was the person who knew the most, who'd been there the longest, who was really that expert in their, in their field. Now the millennials, it's not about that. They want to learn and grow, and they might be experts in 6 or 7 different fields and take up 6 or 7 different professions. So what they're tending to look for is more of that sense of belonging and being part of a greater purpose. They've grown up in, they call it a VUCA world, a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world, which is our current, marketplace. So millennials have grown up in this environment, and they realise that there's lots of complex interrelations between, products, services, and that not one person knows everything, and it's ever changing. So they really want to be part of basically, a diversity around, thought, around projects, having lots of growth and learning opportunities. They don't want to be stuck in the box doing one thing because that's not, the environment that they work in. I mean, Gallup does lots of work in this area, and I think one of their stats I've just got here is 93% of millennials said that they'd leave their roles and they felt they couldn't approach their leader when they wanted to learn more or be stretched and develop. And they found that 70% of the variance in employee engagement was actually attributed to the manager alone. So that leader who actually gives them that purpose, that vision, gives them that opportunity to learn and develop is really what they're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, and there's some great aspects within that in terms of the importance of, creating a clear purpose and vision, that sense of belonging. And I think, maybe aspects of those two components tie into Simon Sinek's notion of why, and people, buying and attaching to a company's why. But also that learning environment, people feeling like they're moving forward, they're acquiring new skills, and they're getting afforded the opportunity to sort of implement those skills. So I think some great answers within that. And I guess I sort of just want to take a bit of a segue, maybe picking up on some of the aspects that you sort of talked about already. But a couple of years ago, I was lucky enough to spend a bit of time in Silicon Valley, and I become really blown away by the lack of stigma around failure. It was so openly talked about and promoted and celebrated, and it was almost like if you haven't failed, then what's wrong with you? And I think that sort of ties back to the fact that if you're not pushing hard and risking failing, and the fact that the comfort zone is safe, but it doesn't create companies like Uber, Facebook, Google, all these revolutionary companies. I guess my question on the back of that is, how do leaders and organisations create environments that promote some form of tolerance and control around making mistakes, or I guess put another way, making failure a positive dynamic in organisations? What's your sort of take on that?
So, I mean, one of the famous, examples is Microsoft, and they've really embraced that culture around risk-taking, and they have one of the largest hackathons, on the planet. And essentially what they're doing is they're setting their employees up to step outside their day jobs and cross-collaborate on some sort of action or idea, in a safe environment, I guess. So they've really, operationalised that's an annual event that is encouraged and embraced. And it's obviously in a controlled environment. So they've set the scene like that. But I mean, there's lots of micro things that organisations can do. It's accepting failure as a success can be built by a leader's reaction to failure. So, when a team member actually, comes and presents a mistake that they've made, that initial reaction that the leader has, is critical around whether the person will actually take risk or ownership again next time. It's funny, I had a meeting the other day with a coaching client, and he talked about how they had this boss who let them have free rein. So they gave them heaps of scope and said, look, this project, you go away, you do it how you want, but if you come back and it fails, it's your head. So that's not how to do it. No. Because is that guy going to take any risk, and doing something out of the square to achieve that project? No, he's going to stick to the status quo. So that leader's, messaging and reaction and how they frame those opportunities, I think, is really critical.
Absolutely. No, I think some interesting notes on that, and I think just sort of building on that a little bit. I think in life in general, but obviously this transcends into the workplace, that candor is rare. And one of the symptoms of safe cultures is that, candor's, a common dynamic within that. And I guess that's, not being afraid to present ideas or being prepared to challenge the status quo, and not having any fear around that. But I mean, how do you create an environment or a culture where this is promoted, it's common? Because I think by nature, humans are maybe just a little bit reluctant to rock the boat at times, or have that sort of fear of conflict and all that sort of stuff. So what's your sort of tips on creating, those safe cultures where candor is a common dynamic within that organisation?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a natural instinct, to preserve your self-image and not look like you're silly or stupid. Questioning is a really good example. As a leader, what sort of questions are you asking? Are you asking questions that are potentially, going to lead to judgment or a yes or a wrong or right answer? Asking questions as a curious inquirer is always a really good way of actually encouraging people to present ideas and challenge the status quo. I mean, if you take again, physical safety, if you look at how questions are asked when an investigation is done in the physical safety space, often, the question will be something along the lines of, have you identified any hazards? Have you complied with the JSA or the standard operating procedures? And what they're really asking is a right or wrong answer. Yes, I have. No, I haven't complied with the procedure. That's why I made this mistake. Versus asking a question that would elicit learning or elicit someone to say, hey, I actually, have thought of a different idea, an innovative idea. It would be very different. So they might say something like, is everything as good as it could be today? Or how could you have made this any different or any better today, the way that you did this particular job? You're really asking as a curious inquirer, which then makes someone feel more relaxed and more likely to give an innovative response and challenge the status quo. Those little micro responses too, as a leader, when someone, I say to leaders, critical is your job is to ask lots of questions. That's the first job. And then the second job is to listen really intently. So when someone's replying to you, making sure you're actually listening to that person with the verbal and non-verbal, because you quickly, you shut down someone quickly when they tell that they can tell that you're not listening. So, often leaders are quite busy and they've already started to think about the next question they want to ask because they've got the information from the answer that the person said in the first two sentences. And so they stop listening properly. Of course, that's going to shut someone down. Then they're unlikely to continue to elaborate.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting notions there, and I think on the first one, asking the right questions, I think generally, people might have a predetermined sort of outcome they're looking to drive towards, and they're just looking to reach that outcome, and their questions reflect that. And I think authors like Liz Wiseman, who wrote a book called Multipliers, and she sort of argued the fact or presented the notion of, the best leaders ask the best questions to get the best outcomes. But I think equally important component that sort of supports that is that act or art of listening. And I think in today's age, when we're so busy, there's so much coming at us, we're so distracted, really just being present and listening to sort of get those gems and the responses and all the rest of it, and show the other person that you actually care enough to listen and engage in their response is just so critical as a leader. So I think some great takeaways there.
I was just going to add, one of the practical ways of implementing this I've seen is a leadership team had one of their KPIs in their meetings. Instead of having a safety share at the start of every meeting, exec meeting, they'd actually have a failure share, and they had to share about an incident or a decision that they made that didn't turn out the way that they expected. But again, it was around actually, letting the rest of the team know that they weren't experts, that everyone fails, that they'd be happy to accept some opinions around what they could have done differently. They made that as part of their, instead of a safety share, which is a really nice way, I think, of normalising and, really embracing that candour.
And what happens when you have leaders do that? I mean, someone takes a lead and, everyone may be a little bit sort of gun shy in the beginning. What actually happens to that group dynamic when, that first person sort of puts their hands up and notes a failure that, they could have concealed or whatever the case? What happens to that group dynamic in that moment?
Yeah, so that's when you really see that, that shift, that they become one instead of silos. You suddenly see this unified, body where there's lots of sharing, there's lots of, cross-referencing, they're drawing on each other. It really takes that team to another level and really moves them out of that silo space. So, and from a cognitive level, when you're in that fear mode, when you're around protecting and looking like the expert and having to, look like you know what you're talking about, if you're acting in a fear mode, your frontal cortex, which is all your thinking brain, your rationalising, your complex thoughts, that part of the brain actually shuts down. So you've got these people are employed for their, cognitive ability, their thinking ability, and you suddenly shut that down. When you then relax that so people feel safe to share and open up, you actually are getting that whole brain to operate in the one, operate. So you're fully harnessing that resource. So you're actually getting more out of the individual.
Yeah, sounds super powerful, particularly when you put it in that psychological or cognitive sort of context, that the fact that you're actually you're limiting your ability to contribute or think or be creative when you're in that fear mode, and in noting that that failure, maybe you're sort of just creating that normalised factor that failure is normal and everyone fails from time to time, and that's okay. So I think it's a great way to sort of start meetings. So it's a good cheer on that one. We talked a little bit more earlier about Project Aristotle. It was reported in the Harvard Business Review. But for those that don't know, it was a study at Google to find out what distinguishes high-performing teams from low-performing teams. And there was all sorts of things in there, or maybe prevailing views going into it that where you went to school, the gender mix, all those sort of common things you think would be a predictor around human capital, and how that might translate to human performance. But the thing that they found was psychologically safe cultures was the most powerful predictor to high-performing teams or cultures. So I guess just building on that sort of study, or that sort of, the findings they had in that, what's your take on that, and how have you seen this to be true in your experience here in Australia?
Yeah, sure. I think that there's lots of this happening, but we just wouldn't call it psychological safety. We'd call it inclusive leadership, or, blue leadership, or we see it all the time. And I mean, I was just reflecting about this particular company I was working with. They had this one maintenance crew that was held up across the business. They had like a fabulous safety record. It was nearly a year without any injuries. And the company was wanting to replicate this team dynamic across the business. And when you actually, spent some time with this team, a lot of it was about the leader. I mean, the leader was a very humble leader. He was very trustworthy. He was calm, and he set a culture. But he really created a sense that everyone was, part of this team and responsible for the performance of this team. and that everyone was valued in the team. And in the interactions that I just had to him, I had one of the maintenance planners come down, and they asked this supervisor about a particular technical question, and instead of himself answering that question, he referred to one of his team and said, oh look, Mike, go and talk to him, he's the expert in that area. So he was really drawing on the resources of his team and made them feel involved. And interestingly, when they had catastrophic maintenance breakdowns, or they arrived on the job and the job hadn't been set up properly by the previous crew, typically what tends to happen is there's the blaming. The other crew didn't leave the job ready, now we're delayed, that's why we couldn't execute on the task. He never did that. He just totally, even if there was a few grumblings, he was totally focused on what's in our control, guys, what are we about, how can we resolve this, what's our action. So it wasn't like he was, sprinkling magic fairy dust anywhere. He was just an extremely humble leader who actually had a clear vision for his team and really, got them to feel like they were part of that and were responsible for getting the outcome. So I think there'd be lots and lots of those teams that exist, across Australia in businesses.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, and there's some real simple stuff in there. Just sort of summarise what you talked about, being humble as a leader, being trustworthy and endearing and creating that sort of culture of trust, being calm as opposed to reactive to situations. Talked about being inclusive in his approach and drawing on different team members to help contribute to things. Maybe moving away from that sort of notion of blame to, okay, well, if there is a catastrophic event, what are the solutions? What are the things within our control? So when you sort of break it down like that, it's not that complex. It's not that crazy to get your head around, but I guess practicing that on a regular basis and being conscious of that, that's the art, I guess. And no doubt that's what you help organisations with your coaching and whatnot. But I think that's a good, really simple answer to that. I'm going to play sort of devil's advocate a touch now. So, and ask you a bit of a question around, how do you walk that tight line between psychologically safe organisations and accountability, noting that both dynamics are important and prevalent within high-performance cultures? What's your sort of take on walking that sort of fine line between the two?
That's usually the first response, when we talk about psychological safety. Does a culture of psychological safety really equate to relaxing performance standards? It's seen as soft. It's letting things go. That's not the case. It's actually, quite the opposite. If you actually imagined a matrix, and Amy Edmondson has a beautiful way of, clarifying this, in a matrix, and on the left-hand side you've got high psychological safety and low psychological safety. And on the other axis, you've got high performance and low performance. What you typically see when you have low psychological safety, where people don't feel they can speak up, where they don't feel like they trust their leader, where they feel uncertain, and then you have low performance, so there's not high expectations, you tend to hit this apathy zone. So people operate on autopilot. They don't really care. There's no discretionary effort. It's go in, do the job, and go home again. Conversely, if you have high psychological safety, so people feel like they can speak up, but you have low standards, this is when people do sit in the comfort zone. So when mistakes are accepted, when there's no real push to extend, people tend to be in the comfort zone, and any of that discretionary effort, they're using, sort of searching Facebook or something. They're not thinking about ways to innovate and learn or do something differently. Low psychological safety and this pressure for high performance standards is probably one of the most common things you get. And this is where people get in the anxiety zone and actually are at greatest risk. So this is what you would most likely see, where there's high expectations around, targets, KPIs, results, and do it or else. So often people feel quite anxious. They don't want to speak up. There are lots of hiding and covering up. They don't innovate. They don't step outside the box. I had a great example of this when I was running a coaching session, and this leader said to me, look at this text message I got from the general manager. And the text message said, you failed to hit the targets. This is what X site got. This is what it must be. Fix it.
Wow.
Getting that, that put him into a spin. He's like, we didn't get it because, and there was reasons around what happened. but it put him in the anxiety zone. He had high performance standards but low psychological safety. There was no discussion with the boss around, what could be different, what needed to happen, why it was the way that it was. Instead, it was just pure judgment. So, that's a really good example and pretty typical example of what tends to happen in business. The utopia, or what you'd want to see, is high psychological safety, where you can put your hand up, ask for help, provide innovative option solutions, plus a push for high standards. So these businesses, they expect high performance and learning from their businesses. And as a leader, you want people to, take risks. You want to avoid unexpected or preventable failures. That's not okay to have a preventable failure or something that you know that it should work out. If you make a mistake in that, then that's not okay. But if you make a mistake in something that has never been tried or tested before, then that's okay, because we can learn from that and adjust next time. So there's that psychological safety around how you treat failures and the two different types of failures. And really the expectation is that, everyone is expected to step up and challenge those boundaries and push more. And by doing that, I guess, in a psychologically safe way, you get both the high psychological, high standards as well as safety, because people are doing it in a safe environment. You can actually measure where your business is at, what quadrant they actually fit into, to work out, what do we need to work on here? Is it around the standards, or is it around, the psychological safety of the business, to work out, a bit of a strategy around how to manage that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and maybe as part of the show notes, we'll sort of share that quadrant, because I think that's a pretty interesting sort of dynamic to bear in mind. But I mean, just picking up on part of that response on your part, what advice, quickly would you give the gentleman that was sharing the text? And obviously it didn't have the desired effect. Obviously there was a desire to communicate. They weren't where they needed to be. But, what would be the short advice you give the individual that decided to send that message via text?
So the leader who sent the message?
Yeah. What would you say? Look, if you were coaching that person.
Yeah. Look, I would, again, I'd be saying to him, look at that, approach this as a curious inquirer. Go and seek information about why was that target not met? What happened? Was there preventative failures? And that's a very different conversation. But were there potential mistakes or failures that were unanticipated, or, events outside their control? So treat it as a curious inquirer, not as a judgment. Yeah, and I'm assuming that the individual, the recipient that got the text message, had high standards themselves. So they're already beating themselves up to a certain extent. So if you come at that from a curious inquirer point of view, then the person would probably own, why they didn't hit it, and therefore be a bit more powerful or engaged around, okay, this is why we didn't hit it. These are my ideas around maybe how we rectify, as opposed to being told via a text and obviously dramatically different sort of impact in terms of the engagement around the situation. That's right.
Yeah. So, I mean, being heard is obviously super important, and opinions clearly count in that context. But Gallup found that just 3 in 10 workers strongly agree that at work their opinions seem to count, but also noted that by moving that ratio to 6 in 10 employees, which on the face of it isn't a big number, organisations could realise a 27% reduction in turnover, 40% reduction in safety incidents, and a 12% increase in productivity. And that was as part of the Gallup State of the Workplace 2017 research. Is there an easy way to sort of bring that to life in organisations? And you touched on that notion before of trying to get that discretionary effort, and the context of the market by and large, particularly in mining and infrastructure at the moment here in Australia, is and obviously other environments like technology, etc. But there's a war for talent. Turnover's high. Trying to attract people is hard, and all that sort of stuff. So, what's your sort of response around bringing that to life, and allowing people to be heard and making sure those opinions are heard and maybe responded to? What's your sort of take on that?
Yeah, so I think, again, we did talk a little bit about it before, is good questioning, and good listening is really the key to that. And I mean, with a lot of this, it's about embedding it in the systems and processes. So, one of the things I did with another client is look at their performance review system. What are you actually capturing? What are the behaviours you're encouraging? And so one of the things that they implemented was one of their KPIs was actually around innovation and, creation. So getting them to behaviourally record, have there been any actions or things that you've done that have helped someone else, or that improve something. So it's around that productivity piece and that innovation piece, and they've put that as part of their KPIs. Another business, again, like I said with the questioning, looked at their safety investigation questions. What are the type of questions we're asking here? Are they eliciting are they more around judgment, right or wrong, or are they actually that curious inquirer? So businesses who are trying to, I guess, embed them in current systems are the ones who are being really successful in this space, because you know what it's like. It's easy to have these ideas and you go to a course and you learn about, questioning, and then you come back to the real world and, you're good for a week and you're trying to implement the strategies, and then you sort of fall back to your old habits. So businesses that really try and embed them in their, KPIs or their safety processes and systems are the ones who are really being quite successful here.
Yeah, I like that answer. Obviously, the importance of questions, and no doubt, obviously, the listening and then the acting on some of those things that come out of those things. But I think the other part of that that's key to make sure it's sustainable and consistent is embedding that in your system. So I think it's easy to go to your courses and learn and get all inspired and whatnot. But, unless it's sort of embedded into a system, then often that will sort of fall away or fall by the wayside. So I think it's a good takeaways there in terms of that. Now, I think this next question is super interesting to me, and I would have thought for most. And often, we are today, we want to go, in the future, and you sort of understand that gap. But wow, change management is super hard, shifting a culture from where it is today to where you want to be tomorrow, and shifting those behaviors and systems and everything else to where, the idealistic sort of state. Yeah, in a simplistic way, if there's a response around that, or if there's a simple response, how do organisations effectively manage change management within their business, in your experience?
Yeah, so look, I sort of used to have a very simple model around this, and I say to leaders, there's really three basic needs that humans have. They have the need to feel safe, the need to feel like they belong, and the need to contribute. And if you think about change with those three pillars, you really can use them as your guiding light around your action. So, how do you make someone feel safe when they're, you're going through change? Because obviously we all like change except when it happens to us. So safety is about giving them as much control as possible. So giving them as much information as possible around, how that change actually affects them, and what are the implications, and what does it look like as best you possibly can, because sometimes you don't know all the answers. The second one is around belonging. So belonging is really around how can you actually get them to be part of the journey. So how can they actually, how will their team actually be part of that journey? What will that look like for their team? And the third one's around contribution. So how are the things that they do and say going to influence the outcome, and what can they do to support others who are going through that change, to give them some sort of sense of control. A sort of example around this I used to use was the floods, the Brisbane floods that we had. And, there was obviously significant amount of, crisis. There was lots of, people having to be managed, to basically perform, emergency response. And I said that even though obviously it was a change in a way, but it was a really good example of those three pillars being enacted. There was lots of safety communication. There was lots of communication around, where the floods were, where you needed to go. There was a real sense of belonging in that crisis. So there was, lots of analogies, we're Queenslanders, we're tough, we can stick through this. And then that contribution piece, people were told what they could do to help this situation be better. So they, were told to get their shovels and head down to XYZ street, to help sort of clear some mud off the footpath. So that's a really nice example of those three basic needs that leaders can really harness in times of, uncertainty and change. and really probably principles to use, obviously in business as well.
I think it's a really simple answer to a complex dynamic. I think some really good takeaways on that. So, I mean, you've been really good in sharing a lot of key aspects today that I think are super relevant and valuable. But I guess I just sort of wanted to further to the experience that we noted before in terms of what you've achieved and what you've done thus far. But how do people find out a little bit more about you and your new business, which is super exciting, Humanology Group? How do people sort of find out more about that?
Yeah, look, you can go to our website, www.humanologygroup.com.au, or find us on LinkedIn, and there'll be some more information up there and some more blogs to come.
And just on that, you've been really, really good, Naomi, today about sort of sharing some of the key sort of notions around growth mindset, psychological safety, and various aspects that sort of tie into that. And you're kicking off this new business, which is super exciting, and Humanology Group. So where can people find out a little bit more about you and the business? And I guess once you sort of ask that question, I guess I'm keen to understand why you started this company and essentially what's the purpose of the organisation.
Yeah, sure. You can go to our website, www.humanologygroup.com.au, and there'll be some more information there. I mean, the reason for starting this was I was really working in that wellbeing space, and lots of businesses were implementing fabulous initiatives to really help, their individuals' wellbeing. But the power was really around the organisational health. And, what I found is that if you've got people doing good work in a good place, it actually manages their wellbeing and is such a protective factor. So I started to look at, how can we focus on that? And what I found was, psychological safety is key to actually making it a great place to work, but it's also key to actually business performance. So it helps businesses deliver on innovation, it helps them deliver on diversity and inclusion, it helps them deliver on growth. So really bringing it back to simplifying, if I can help businesses achieve a culture of psychological safety through their leaders and their systems and processes, then you're killing a lot of birds with one stone. So hopefully...
No, I love that, and maybe being less reactive and sort of more front-loading on that side of being more proactive in that regard. But, I guess sort of just in closing, there's no doubt you're really well regarded across the sector and what you do already, and no doubt I think with this new organisation and what you've done today to sort of, in a simple fashion unpack what psychological safety is and the benefit and the upside to individuals and organisations really, really good. I love, the journey that you're on individually. I love the fact that your 7-year-old's now on this journey, being supported by a teacher, which is fantastic. I love to see more of that. But I think the thing that you're doing most, Naomi, is helping people and businesses become the best version of themselves, which I think is really, really cool. So you're having a really big impact, and I'm really, really grateful that you took the time to share some of these aspects today. And no doubt there's a lot of key takeaways for those that will listen to it. So really grateful, and thanks so much for sharing those aspects. It's been really, really good.
Thanks very much for your time, Sean.
Cheers, Naomi.
Thanks. Bye.
On the back end of that podcast here today, I think there's some really great, simple takeaways from Naomi that we can sort of seek to take to ourselves as individuals or our organisations. So I think really impactful stuff that we covered. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you did enjoy, feel free to pass on the details or, rate or follow the podcast. We're building up a great listener base and get some really good feedback. So really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen, and really hope you enjoyed the podcast with Naomi today. Thank you.